You know, there's something incredibly fascinating about complicated stories and characters. The ones that don't just tell you who the hero or villain is, but instead make you sit with the gray areas, the messy, confusing, all too human parts. These stories make me think, make me feel, and sometimes they even force me to look at myself in ways I wasn't expecting. Take one of my favorite games, Hotline Miami, for instance. It is intentionally fragmented, morally ambiguous, and full of unreliable narration. At its core, the game explores themes like violence, identity, and manipulation, but it presents them in a way that forces the player to question everything. Or take one of my favorite anime characters, Lane Irakura, for example. Lane exists simultaneously as a human being and a digital construct within the Wired. She struggles to reconcile with these versions of herself, questioning whether she's an individual with her own thoughts and feelings or just a projection of someone else's design. Her journey reflects themes of loneliness, the dissolution of personal boundaries in the digital age, and the fragile line between who we are in reality versus who we are online. These stories make me think, make me feel, and sometimes they even force me to look at myself in ways I wasn't expecting. Fiction like this feels alive, unpredictable, raw, and deeply personal. And for me, one story that embodies all of that in such a profound way is Goodnight, Punpun by Ino Aisano. It's a story that doesn't just tell you things, it makes you feel them in the most uncomfortably relatable ways. Goodnight, Punpun by Ino Aisano is a deeply complex and emotional coming-of-age story that takes us on an unforgettable journey through the turbulent world of adolescence. The story centers around Punpun Panyama, a young boy who is growing up in an environment filled with emotional chaos, broken relationships, and a family that seems to fall apart as he does. It's a narrative that feels incredibly raw and personal, almost as if Punpun is someone you might know or even someone you've been. What makes Goodnight, Punpun so unique isn't just the story of Punpun's life or his experiences. What makes it stand out is how that story is told and how deeply the narrative intertwines with the development of Punpun's character and the way we perceive him. You see, as Punpun grows older, the way he views the world changes, and so does the way we see him through art. At the beginning of the story, Punpun is depicted in a childlike form, a bird-like figure with an exaggerated beak, wide eyes, and blank expression. This isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a powerful visual representation of how Punpun feels. He's isolated, disconnected, and at times completely numb to the world around him. Even when he's surrounded by family, friends, and even love, there's a layer of detachment between him and everything else, a barrier that makes it hard for him to truly connect or understand the emotions of others. This bird-like form represents sense of emotional distance, almost as if he's unable to fully integrate into the human world. As Punpun navigates the pain of growing up, the story also takes us through his internal journey, showing how his emotional and physiological state slowly transforms. As he faces the trauma of losing loved ones, experiencing heartbreak, and the crushing weight of his own mistakes, his representation shifts. The artwork transitions from that simple, almost comedic bird image to something more complex and unsettling. As Punpun struggles to understand who he is, the art style begins to shift, reflecting his inner turmoil. His bird-like appearance is replaced with more abstract, fragmented depictions, sometimes showing him as monstrous, sometimes as a hollow shell of the person he once was. The world around him also distorts, blurring reality and fiction as his grasp on what's real becomes weaker. Goodnight, Punpun stands out as one of the most compelling and emotionally charged manga because it blends raw, unflinching realism with deeply introspective themes. At its core, the story explores the struggles of growing up, how painful and confusing it can be to navigate identity, relationships, and trauma. Punpun, the protagonist, is flawed and deeply human, which makes his journey both heartbreaking and relatable. His emotional journey is something many people can connect with, even as the manga dives into heavier themes like mental health, abuse, and existential despair. What truly makes Goodnight, Punpun exceptional, however, is how it uses its art style to amplify these themes. The contrast between the surreal, sometimes absurd imagery and the harsh, grounded narrative creates a unique reading experience that mirrors Punpun's mental state. As he grows older, the shifts in his appearance, from his innocent bird-like form to more grotesque depictions, reflect his inner turmoil and disillusionment with the world. The artwork isn't merely a visual complement, it's a vital part of the emotional experience, intensifying every instance of growth, pain, and self-doubt. The pacing of the story is another strength, as it takes its time to explore Punpun's relationships and inner conflicts, allowing readers to feel the weight of his decisions. It's a manga that doesn't offer easy answers to clear resolutions, which makes it feel more real and reflective of life's complexities. The open-ended nature of the story invites you to think deeply about its meaning long after you've finished reading. Ultimately, Goodnight Punpun succeeds because it's more than just a story about a boy growing up. It's an exploration of what it means to live, to suffer, and to question the world around you. Its emotional depth, thematic complexity, and innovative art style combine to create a work that resonates on a deeply personal level. Goodnight Punpun is relatable because it captures the messy, uncomfortable reality of growing up, something everyone can connect with. It's not just about the big dramatic events in life, but the quiet eternal struggles we face as we navigate the complexities of identity, relationships, and our own personal flaws. The main character, Punpun, feels like someone you might know, or even someone you've been. He's a young boy trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense to him, and that's a feeling many of us have had at one point or another. The way Goodnight Punpun shows Punpun's growth from childhood into adolescence feels painfully real. It captures moments of confusion, loneliness, and the difficulty of understanding who you are and what your place in the world is. The themes of love, loss, and self-discovery are explored in ways that don't sugarcoat the harshness of life, but still feel deeply human. Punpun's emotional experiences, even though they're extreme at times, reflect the feelings we all experience, whether it's the confusion of your first crush, the pain of a broken family, or the struggle to understand your own mind. What makes it even more relatable is how the manga dives into the messiness of relationships, not just with family and friends, but with yourself. Punpun isn't perfect, and neither are the people around him. The characters are complex with their own issues and flaws, making their interactions feel realistic and raw. It's a reminder that no one really has it all together, and that we're all just trying to figure things out in our own way. In short, Goodnight Punpun is relatable because it doesn't shy away from the difficulties of growing up. It captures the emotional confusion and turbulence of adolescence while exploring themes of self-worth, trauma, and connection in a way that feels true to life. Did you find Punpun relatable at any point in the story? If so, which parts and why?
I did find Punpun as a very relatable character during the whole story. You know, you're very close to his thoughts and experiences, that it just kind of makes you realize he's just another guy like yourself. But his obsession with Aiko was very interesting to me. I feel like I can kind of understand the dependency that he had with Aiko. During the whole manga, you can see him talk about her and make comments about her, and it almost seems like without her in his life, he's empty. I can kind of see and understand why, but it was just a very interesting, like, part about Punpun that I relate to.
Did the story ever make you feel uncomfortable in a way that made you reflect on your life?
There's lots of parts in this story that make me pretty uncomfortable, but one that stood out was just Aiko's death. It's nearby the end of the book, so you feel pretty connected to the characters at that point, or at least I did. So just knowing Punpun so well and knowing how it would affect him, and getting to learn about Aiko's like home life and everything, when you get to find out that she committed suicide, you just feel kind of empty.
Do you feel personally connected to the story? If so, could you share how it resonates with you?
I personally feel connected to the story because of Punpun's intrusive thoughts. He deals with what he called God, which are really just his own intrusive thoughts. And I feel like I can relate a lot with that, and that's what I connect with the book.
Were there any characters besides Punpun that stood out to you as especially complex or memorable?
At one point in the story, when Punpun was in about middle school, he was in a badminton club with Aiko's ex-boyfriend Yaguchi. He stood out to me quite a bit. Punpun, um, when he found out that Yaguchi and Aiko were dating, he was pretty upset that he had lost Aiko, I guess. And Yaguchi noticed that. So he made a bet to him that if he had won a game that would put him in a tournament, Aiko was his. But if he lost, Aiko would be Punpun's. Yaguchi had an injured leg, which made the game not be in his favor. I don't understand why he did such a childish move, because he wouldn't have won. And in the end, you just feel very bad for him, because even though like you can see that Yaguchi is a very popular and kind guy, he for some reason thinks less of himself to Punpun, which made him lose someone very beloved to him.
Depression is hard to explain. It's heavy, isolating, and sometimes it feels like no one truly understands what you're going through. But Goodnight Punpun was one of the first stories that made me feel like I wasn't alone. It validated my feelings in a way that no advice or conversation ever could. It wasn't afraid to show how messy, confusing, and even ugly life can get. And in that, I found comfort. It helped me realize that what I was feeling was real, but it also showed me why it was so important to take steps toward healing before I spiraled even further. Goodnight Punpun doesn't sugarcoat the experience of depression or mental health struggles. It shows it for what it is: confusing, overwhelming, and deeply personal. Punpun, like many of us, tries to carry the weight of his emotions alone, and it's through his journey that I started to see my own struggles reflected back at me. His feelings of alienation and his constant questioning of his self-worth, those things I knew all too well. But the story didn't just validate how I was feeling, it also gave me a wake-up call. There were certain moments where I saw what could happen if I didn't take my mental health seriously, if I let myself stay stuck in that cycle of negativity, and those moments hit me hard. There's a point in the story where Punpun becomes so consumed by his own thoughts and emotions that he starts cutting himself off from everyone around him. He stops reaching out, stops connecting, and lets himself think deeper into his own mind. It's so subtle at first, but then it snowballs and you see how isolation starts to take over his life. When I read that, it was like holding up a mirror. I realized that I've been doing the same thing, pushing people away because I didn't think they'd understand or because I felt like a burden. But seeing it play out in Punpun's life made me realize how dangerous that cycle could be. It's not just about feeling lonely, it's about how isolation feeds the depression, making it even harder to break free. There's another moment in Goodnight Punpun that really stuck with me. Without spoiling too much, it's a point where Punpun's unresolved pain catches up with him in a big way. He tries to ignore it, bury it, and pretend it doesn't exist. But eventually it becomes too much. You can see how the weight of it affects his relationships, his choices, and even his view of himself. That moment was like a warning for me. It made me realize that if I didn't address the things I was going through, they wouldn't just go away. They'd fester and grow, and eventually they'd overwhelm me just like they did Punpun. It was the wake-up call I needed to start figuring out how to heal, even if that meant taking small steps at first. Reading Goodnight Punpun wasn't easy. It forced me to confront things I'd been avoiding for a long time, but it also gave me hope. It reminded me that my feelings were valid, that it's okay to feel lost, sad, or confused. What's important is what you do next. I started reaching out to friends, journaling, and slowly opening up about what I was going through. It wasn't an overnight fix, but it was a start. And honestly, I don't know if I would have taken that step if I hadn't seen what happens when you let the darkness take over like Punpun did. This story didn't just speak to me, it pushed me to act. So if you're struggling or have ever felt like the weight of the world is too much to bear, I'd recommend Goodnight Punpun. It's not just a story, it's a reminder that you're not alone in what you're feeling and that healing is possible even if it takes time.